The smell of motor oil and cold metal was the first thing I noticed when the blindfold came off. My wrists were bound behind me, the plastic zip tie cutting into my skin every time I shifted. Across the dim room, a man stood with his back to me, speaking quietly into a phone. When he finally turned around, his eyes moved over me the way a jeweler examines a stone, calculating, detached, looking for flaws. Then his gaze dropped to my collarbone. He stopped mid-sentence. The phone went silent in his hand. "Where did you get that?" he said, not to his associate. To me. I looked down at the small gold compass rose hanging from the chain around my neck, the one my mother had pressed into my palm the morning she disappeared from my life 17 years ago. I had worn it every single day since I was 8 years old. "It was my mother's," I said. The room went very still. He took 2 slow steps toward me, crouched down to my eye level, and studied the pendant with an expression I could not read. Then he said something that cracked my entire understanding of that night wide open. "Tell me her name." 3 months earlier, I had been the kind of person who believed that working hard and loving someone honestly was enough to build a life on. I was 31, a licensed physical therapist with my own small caseload, an apartment I was proud of, and a boyfriend named Marcus who had a talent for making the ordinary feel like something worth celebrating. We had been together 2 years. I thought I knew him completely. The warning signs were things I had explained away so many times they had worn smooth grooves in my thinking. The weeks he spent traveling for work without much detail, the phone calls he took in the garage. The way certain conversations ended not with resolution, but with distraction, a kiss on the forehead, a changed subject, a glass of wine appearing in my hand, before I realized I had never gotten my answer. My father had died when I was 12, and I had been raised after that by my Uncle Gerald, my father's older brother, a quiet and methodical man who worked as a financial consultant and had stepped into the role of parent with more duty than warmth. He was not cruel. He was precise. He ran our household the way he ran his accounts, organized, predictable, efficient. I was grateful for him in the way you are grateful for a roof. You do not think about it until the weather turns. My mother was a subject Uncle Gerald had closed early and firmly. She had left, he told me, when I was 8. She had chosen a different life. He said it once and never repeated it, which was its own kind of message. I had learned not to ask. The compass rose was all I had of her. I remembered her fastening it around my neck the night before she was gone, her fingers warm, her voice soft, her eyes holding something I was too young to name. "This belonged to my grandmother," she had said. "It means you always find your way home." By the time Marcus came into my life, I had built a version of myself that did not need that story to have a different ending. I was fine. I was stable. I was, I thought, loved. When Marcus asked me to come with him to his colleague's wedding in Savannah, I said yes without hesitation. When he suggested I take a week off from work beforehand so we could drive down slowly, stop at places along the way, make a trip of it, I cleared my schedule and packed a bag. We left on a Tuesday morning. I remember the exact moment the trip stopped feeling like a vacation. We were somewhere outside of Augusta, and Marcus had grown quiet in a way that was different from his usual comfortable silence. His jaw was set. He had checked his phone 4 times in the last 20 minutes. When I reached over and touched his arm, he flinched. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said, "just thinking about the drive." We stopped at a gas station. He told me he needed to make a quick call and stepped away from the car. I watched him through the windshield. He was not making a call. He was texting, fast and deliberate. His body turned so I could not see the screen. When he got back in the car, I said nothing. Something in me had gone very quiet, and that quietness had its own kind of intelligence. We did not drive to Savannah. I did not understand that until 40 minutes later, when Marcus pulled onto a county road I did not recognize, drove another 10 minutes through dense Georgia pine, and stopped in front of a warehouse-style building with 2 men standing outside it who clearly had not come to wish anyone congratulations on their marriage. I had just enough time to reach for the door handle before Marcus said, "Don't. Please." His voice had no anger in it. It had something worse than anger. It had the flat, practiced tone of a decision already made. "Marcus," I said, "what is this?" He would not look at me. The men outside opened my door. What followed was the most disorienting night of my life, and I have replayed it in detail so many times that the sequence is worn smooth: the zip tie, the blindfold, the sound of gravel under tires, the smell of pine giving way to diesel, the complete absence of Marcus's voice from the moment those men took my arm. I was transported in the back of a vehicle for what felt like close to 2 hours. I counted my breaths. It was the only thing I could control. When I was walked inside somewhere that smelled like climate-controlled wealth, old wood, and something faintly floral, the blindfold came off and I was in that dim room, in that chair, across from the man who had not yet told me his name. His name, I would learn, was Declan. He was in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had once been conventionally handsome and had since become something more interesting, lined, watchful, carrying the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades paying attention to things others missed. He dressed well without any showiness. He looked, I remember thinking, like a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything. When he crouched in front of me and looked at the compass rose, what I saw in his face was not greed, not calculation, not the assessment I had been bracing for. It was recognition. "Tell me her name," he said. I held his gaze. "Why?" "Because if you are who I think you are," he said quietly, "then the people who brought you here tonight have made a very serious mistake." My chest was tight. "Her name was Celeste," I said. "Celeste Rourke." Declan sat back on his heels. He pressed one hand briefly over his mouth. Then he stood, walked to the door, and said something to the man outside in a low, controlled voice that I could not hear, but whose effect was immediate. The energy in the building shifted, footsteps moved quickly down a hall, and the zip tie was cut from my wrists within 60 seconds. "I owe you an explanation," Declan said when he came back. "And I owe you an apology on behalf of people I was foolish enough to trust." I rubbed my wrists and looked at him. "Start with the explanation." What Declan told me over the next hour rearranged every story I had ever been given about my own life. My mother, Celeste Rourke, had not left. She had been pushed out methodically, legally, and with deliberate cruelty by my Uncle Gerald, who had spent the better part of 3 years manufacturing evidence that she was unstable, financially irresponsible, and an unfit mother. He had hired people to help him do it. He had used his position as a financial consultant to drain an account my father had left jointly in both his and Celeste's names. He had shown a family court judge documentation that Celeste's own attorney, a man Gerald had quietly placed in her corner, had helped falsify. My mother had not chosen a different life. She had been legally removed from mine, stripped of custody, and left with nothing. She had spent years trying to find a way back in, and years more simply trying to survive what had been done to her. Declan had known Celeste. He had known her well. He had been, in a time before my memory, someone she trusted. When she disappeared from public life, he had searched for her and eventually lost the thread. The compass rose. He recognized it because he had been with her the day she bought it from a craftsman at a street market in Charleston, the summer before she married my father. He had teased her about it. She had laughed and said it was for her daughter someday. "I have been in businesses I am not proud of," Declan said carefully. "The men who brought you to me tonight work in networks I have ties to, but I have spent the last several years trying to dismantle those ties, not extend them. Whoever arranged this transaction," he paused, "did not do it for money." "Then why?" I said, though I already felt the answer forming in my chest like something cold. "Because someone wanted you gone," he said, quietly, with no trail, "and whoever arranged it knew exactly which network to use. My uncle had introduced me to Marcus. I want to tell you that I fell apart then, that I crumbled. That I sat in that chair in Declan's building in the Georgia countryside and cried for the 8-year-old girl who had stood at the window watching her mother's car drive away and not understood why she never came back. I did not fall apart. I think I was too far past the point where falling apart would have helped. What I felt instead was a very cold, very clear anger, the kind that does not shake you but settles into your bones and turns everything sharp and precise. My uncle arranged this," I said. "It was not a question." Declan looked at me. "I believe so, yes. And Marcus?" "A hired instrument." He likely knew very little about the why. I thought about 2 years. 2 years of Sunday mornings and shared playlists and grocery runs, and the particular intimacy of knowing someone's coffee order and the exact cadence of their breathing when they sleep. 2 years that had apparently been a job. "Where is my mother?" I said. Declan was quiet for a moment. "I don't know where she is now, but I can help you find out." The next 72 hours were the strangest of my life, stranger even than the night of the warehouse. Declan was not a good man in any uncomplicated sense. He was a man who occupied a complicated moral territory and had been, for a long time, comfortable there. But he was also a man who had known my mother when she was young and whole and happy, and whatever she had meant to him I did not ask, and he did not offer. He treated the project of finding her with a seriousness and a speed that I was in no position to question. He had resources I did not, people who owed him things, access to records that should not have been accessible. Within 36 hours, he had a last known address in Asheville, North Carolina. Within 48, he had a current one. He also had, by the morning of the second day, a folder of documents that laid out what my uncle had done with a precision that any family court in the country would have found very difficult to ignore. I called a friend, my closest friend, Petra, who was a paralegal in Atlanta, and who had, upon receiving my "I am safe, but please do not tell anyone where I am" text on night 1, responded with a string of messages that alternated between fury and practical questions. I told her everything. She connected me, within hours, with an attorney who specialized in family fraud cases and custody fraud specifically. I did not go to the police first. I want to be honest about that. I went to a lawyer first, because I had learned from the story of my own mother that having the documentation in order before you walk into an official room makes all the difference. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. She was methodical, unsentimental, and magnificent. She reviewed what Declan had compiled, added her own investigators to fill gaps, and within 2 weeks had a case that she described, in the careful language of her profession, as unusually well supported. I had not contacted my uncle during any of this. He had called 3 times in the first week, twice on my cell, and once through Petra, which told me he knew I was with her. His messages were the right mixture of concern and mild irritation, calibrated precisely to sound like a worried relative and not like a man checking whether his plan had worked. I listened to them, and I did not call back. I did, however, call the number Declan had found for my mother. It rang 4 times. Then a woman's voice, careful, a little guarded, the voice of someone who had learned to answer the phone without expectation, said hello. I said, "My name is Nora. I'm calling because I've been wearing your compass rose for 23 years. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said my name, just my name once, in a voice that did not sound like a stranger's. My mother was 58. She lived in a 2-bedroom house in Asheville with a vegetable garden in the back and a job managing accounts for a small regional nonprofit. She was calm and careful and deeply, visibly scarred in the way of someone who has processed tremendous damage and learned to carry it without advertising it. When I drove to Asheville and stood on her front porch and she opened the door, we stood looking at each other for a long moment before either of us moved. She looked like me. I had not expected that. I had carried her in my memory as something almost abstract, a feeling of warmth and the smell of her hair and her hands fastening a clasp at the back of my neck. Seeing her as a real, present, aging woman who had my same stubborn jaw and my same way of standing with her weight slightly forward was something I had not prepared for. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. She told me what had been done to her. I told her what I had found. She was very still while I talked, and when I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I looked for you until I couldn't anymore. I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "And then I just tried to stay alive," she said, "because I thought if I stayed alive there was a chance." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "There was," I said. The case against my Uncle Gerald moved through the legal system with the particular momentum of something that had been building for a long time. The fraud had been meticulous, but Sandra Okafor was more meticulous. The financial records Declan had helped surface showed clearly the account manipulation from the year of my parents' divorce. The attorney my mother had been assigned, now disbarred for unrelated matters, had left a paper trail that a careful investigator could follow. My uncle called me one more time, 3 weeks after I had stopped responding. His voice on that call was different from the worried relative voice of the earlier messages. It was tight, controlled, aware. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said. "Yes, you do," I said. There was a pause. "Nora, you don't understand the full picture. I understand that you spent 3 years taking my mother apart piece by piece," I said, "and then raised me for 20 years as though you were doing me a favor. I understand that very clearly." He started to speak. I ended the call. Sandra filed the full complaint 4 days later. My uncle hired the most expensive attorney in his Rolodex. It did not matter as much as he needed it to. I think about Marcus sometimes. I found out, eventually, that he had been recruited through a network of people who moved in the outer orbit of my uncle's professional world, people who handled certain problems for certain clients and never asked too many questions. He had been told I was a woman with a history of instability who needed to be relocated for her own safety. He had been paid well to believe that framing. Whether he had ever actually believed it, Or whether belief had simply been the more comfortable option, I cannot say. I found I did not need to resolve that question to keep moving. What I kept coming back to was the pendant. My mother had put it around my neck as a goodbye she could not afford to name. I had carried it through 23 years of not knowing, through the hollow years with my uncle, through the work of building myself into someone functional, through 2 years with a man who was never what I thought he was. I had worn it so consistently it had become invisible to me, just part of the surface of my own body. And then a stranger in a dim room had looked at it, and the whole locked door of my history had swung open. There is something I want to say to you, and I want to say it clearly because I know some of you listening to this have your own locked doors. Your own things you have been told that made the shape of your life smaller than it needed to be. Your own people who were supposed to protect you and spent that protection on themselves instead. You are not obligated to keep holding the version of the story they handed you. I am not standing here telling you that everything resolves neatly, that courtrooms always deliver justice, or that mothers and daughters who have been separated for 23 years simply pick up where they left off. It is not neat. My mother and I are learning each other slowly and with effort, the way you learn a language you should have been raised speaking. There are things between us that the missing years made strange, and we are both honest enough to acknowledge that. But she is here. I am here. And whatever my uncle spent 20 years trying to eliminate the connection between us, the history, the fact of who I came from, it is here too. He could not sell that. He could not document it away. He could not cut it from me with a zip tie in the back of a car on a county road in Georgia. I walked onto a stage 8 months after that night to accept a recognition award from the nonprofit my mother works for. She had nominated me, quietly, for pro bono work I had done with their clients. I did not know until I got there. When I stood at the podium and saw her in the 3rd row, sitting straight in her chair, watching me with that careful and no longer guarded expression, I put my hand briefly to my collarbone. The compass rose was there. It always finds its way home.